Whoops. Sorry it took a while to get this out. I've been working on my thesis and life caught up with me way faster than I thought it would. But, as a trade-off, I've got a Hunter Prismatic build that has some of the best ability rotations I've seen with great damage to boot. Unlike any of the builds I try and make, they have to feel fun to use, and this absolutely does. It's not only constant ability spam, but it's a playstyle that hunters have never really got to express properly till now. This build has some amazing super regen and is one of the best builds at both reaching Transcendence and using it because of this build's interactions with its grenades. It's got amazing survivability, great ad clear, and really solid damage in extended DPS settings. Fair warning before starting, I'm going to be doing quicker descriptions to save both you and me some time. Sound good? That's enough yapping from me though, let's get into it. First off, abilities. Threaded Spike is here for debuffing with Sever, spawning in tangles, and giving dark energy to our Transcendence bar. It's going to jump up to 9 people, and hitting targets and catching it on the way back will refund melee energy, with 5 hits fully charging it. Remember that the first and second bounce of Threaded Spike deal more damage, and genuinely, don't underestimate how much dark Transcendence bar this thing can charge, especially if you're then using the tangle it spawns afterwards. Next up, grenades. In this build you're going to want the magnetic grenade. It attaches to a target, deals a tiny bit of damage on attaching, then it explodes twice doing a bit of AoE. It's not the highest damage grenade, but it's extremely reliable in its single target damage, which is something this build really appreciates. For aspects, your first pick is going to be Stylish Executioner, which on killing a target with an elemental debuff will give you invisibility, true sight, and your next melee from being invisible will weaken and deal increased damage, although it's your unpowered melee that weakens, not your Threaded Spike. The reason we've got this is purely for survivability, and because the build has so many ways to loop debuffs, especially because of one fragment in particular, you're going to be proccing this loads, making you way more difficult to kill. Our second aspect is Gunpowder Gamble, which allows you to throw a grenade that causes an ignition. On Prismatic exclusively, instead of needing solar ability or weapon kills, it now reads defeat targets with abilities, elemental debuff damage, or solar weapons. In this build, the only part you're really going to care about, to be honest, are the ability kills and debuff damage, as we're not running a single solar weapon in this setup. Not that it matters, because this aspect is constantly up with how many abilities we're throwing out. Pretty much any time you perform an action with this build, you'll have a Gunpowder Gamble charged up afterwards, and really importantly, this ability, although being an ignition, still has all the properties of a grenade, meaning it'll benefit from mods, exotics, and fragments that interact with grenades. And lastly is our super, where you're going to want to run Silence and Squall. The super by itself, as a standalone ability, isn't that impactful. It just does AoE slow and freeze, but in Prismatic, it really shines. This super single-handedly just gives entire Dark Transcendence bars, and that really is the way you have to think about this super. I'll try run some clips in the background, but you'll hopefully see how quickly I go back to back on Transcendence, just because this super is roaming around whenever I'm fighting. It literally takes seconds for your Transcendence to be back if your super is out and you're using your light abilities and weapons, and the build only starts moving up in power when we add our exotics into the mix. For your exotic armor, your choice is going to be Relativism, the new exotic class item, and you're looking for 2 specific perks. First one is Spirit of Galanor, which returns super energy on hits and kills once your super ends. Just from some quick testing I did, it looks to be up to 50% super energy, much like the base version of the exotic, difference being that Silence and Squall is hitting so often that it's pretty much guaranteed to return half your super. And the second perk is Spirit of Verities, which on weapon kills matching your grenade element gives a stack of death throws for 10 seconds, which gives your grenade 20% increased damage, stacking up to 5 times. I do just quickly want to say that this is the ideal role. I know that getting the exact class item you want is super up to your RNG on the day, So as an alternative, you could look for Spirit of Inmost Light as another option in the first column, but Verities in the second is a must for the build. If you can't get the rolls I mentioned here, just make sure you have Verities at the very least, and the build will still work really well, just not at its best. And the main reason why Verities is so important here is that it's buffing every grenade in this build. Your Magnetic Grenade is obviously getting buffed, but both Gunpowder Gamble as well as Hailfire Spike, your Transcendent Grenade, gets the buff. You'll have Hailfire Spike up loads because getting Transcendence in this build is a breeze, and you'll have Gunpowder Gamble up literally all of the time because of how much debuffing and ability kills you'll be getting. And because this is a grenade build, for your exotic weapon you're 100% going to want the Buried Bloodline. It has lifesteal on hitting a target, and on killing 4 red bars or 1 yellow bar or higher, you'll get Devour for 10 seconds. With the Catalyst though, whilst you have Devour active, this weapon also weakens on hit for 5 seconds. Just from one gun, you get Survivability in Devour, Magnetic Grenade regen in Devour, a debuff which can make our grenades land even harder, and it can also proc Stylish Executioner by itself, because Weaken is a debuff, meaning free invis for just shooting the gun. The thing is nuts, and it really brings this entire build together. And one thing that is really important to point out here is that no matter what grenade is active, whether you have Gunpowder Gamble up or you're in Transcendence with Hailfire Spike, Void weapon kills will always give the Death Throws buff. It's not like because you have Gunpowder Gamble up, you now need to get solar weapon kills. It is always void weapon kills. Next, we've got Fragments, and the power these bring to the build are seriously strong. I genuinely think Prismatic has some of the most influential fragments in the game, next to ones like Ember of Empyrean. The first one you'll want to take here is Faceted Bravery, which on grenade final blows will give your void weapons volatile rounds, and on powered melee kills, give your strand weapons unraveling rounds for 10 seconds. I cannot stress how much uptime on volatile rounds you'll have with this setup. It'll feel like you're getting volatile more often than Geofalcons if you're using your grenades, and because Threaded Spike is self-refunding, you'll have super easy access to Unravel as well. And again, these are both debuffs, meaning if anything that dies from Volatile or Unravel will charge up your Gunpowder Gamble as well as proc Stylish Executioner. Next, you're going to take 2 fragments that are going to help with getting Transcendence quicker in Facet of Sacrifice, which whilst you have a Solar, Void or Arc buff, will give you bonus Dark Transcendence energy on ability final blows, and then Facet of Devotion 2, which on killing a target with a Stasis or Strand debuff, gives bonus light energy. We pretty much always have Devour up, meaning Facet of Sacrifice will be up almost all of the time, and this also isn't including some extra light buffs we'll receive from our seasonal artifact, and Devotion will be fueled by Unravel and Sever from our Threaded Spike, which again is self-refunding, meaning you have constant access to Facet of Devotion's effect. Next, you want to take Facet of Purpose, which is going to be another way where add survivability to the build, which on picking up an orb will give you a buff matching your super. So in this case, because we're using Silence in School, you'll get 2 stacks of Frost Armor, the new Stasis keyword, for 10 seconds, which is a damage resist. It can stack up to 5 times with each stack giving a 4.5 damage resist, up to a max of 22.5. And lastly, you're going to want to pick up Facet of Courage, which causes your Arc, Solar and Void abilities to deal 10% increased damage to targets affected by a Strand or Stasis debuff. There's 3 main ways that this fragment will be active. Firstly is from Threaded Spike applying Sever, or if you've landed a melee kill before from Unraveling rounds from Bravery. And third is from the slow and freeze that Hailfire Spike applies during Transcendence. And lastly, for ability related stuff, we've got the seasonal artifact mods. At the time of making this, we're in season 24, so if you're watching this from the far future, just skip to the timestamp on screen for the mod and weapon setup. From the seasonal artifact, there's 5 mods that you should be running in this setup. First one is Threaded Blast, where destroying a tangle with a strand weapon will cause a larger and more damaging explosion, which is really nice for just giving a bit more dark energy for Transcendence. Next up is Void hegemony? I'm just going to call it the void thingy, where if you're on a void or prismatic subclass, killing a weakened target gives a 15 HP overshield. This synergizes really nicely with Berry Bloodline, as that weapon weakens, so you're just getting a little bit more survivability on top of Devour, Stylish, Frost Armor, and the DR given by Transcendence. And you'll also want Radiant Orbs, which is just when on a Prismatic or Solar subclass, you get Radiant for 10 seconds when picking up an orb. Where you'll really start to see some impactful changes in the build though, is in the 5th column with Shield Crush, which has the effect of when you have Woven Mail, Frost Armor, or a Void Overshield, your melee gains 25% additional base recharge and you gain 25% more melee damage, and whilst Radiant or Amplified, your grenade gains 25% additional base recharge rate and deals 25% increased damage. These are just straight up passive damage bonuses in an ability based build, so these are must this season. Their effect is really strong and proccing them is so simple. And the last artifact mod you'll want is Transference, which whilst Transcendent causes your grenade and melee to deal an increased 10% damage, and once Transcendence ends, you'll get Transcendence energy back depending on how many weapon kills you got during Transcendence. The main thing we care about here is the grenade damage, but the extra Transcendence energy is a nice bonus along with it. And that's everything to do with abilities. I'm going to really quickly do the mod setup, and then we're going to move on to how you want to use and play this build. Helmet is Void Siphon, Ashes to Assets, Special Ammo Finder. Arms is 1 Firepower, 1 Momentum Transfer. Chest is up to you. I've really enjoyed using double Void reserves here because both are heavy and special will be Void, but you could easily just swap one or both of those out for resist mods. Legs is double Void Surge, and Cloak is Reaper and Distribution. If you're happy not having a stat boost on your Cloak, you can add in another Distribution and 1 copy of Bomber, as the Cloak can be upgraded to Artifice Armor. Stat setup should focus on Resilience, then Discipline, then Intellect. As for weapons, you're going to want to have some kind of Strand Primary, and the faster firing it is, the better. This is just because it makes it much easier for you to spray down a room really quickly with Unraveling rounds, and then you can switch to Buried Bloodline or your Heavy to keep up your Death Throw stats. And you'll also need a Strand Gun to benefit from Threaded Blast effect. As a bonus, if you've got a Strand Primary that has Slice, you can also use that as another way to proc Facet of Courage without having to solely rely on Threaded Spike. As for your Heavy, it should definitely be Void to synergize with Verities, and I was really enjoying using an LMG here because of how well it was able to spread and re-proc Volatile. I was using an Adrenaline Junkie Demolitionist corrective measure during my sessions, but Commemoration could be a really good choice here, especially if you've got a Repulsor Brace roll which can stack up Void Overshields insanely quickly. Although, if you're wanting to take this build to do DPS, nothing really beats an Envious Assassin Bait and Switch Edge Transit just because of how much damage that thing can pump out. And that's the build setup. Now on to playing it and some of the tips I can give from my experience with this build. Simple one to start with, Devour is so important in the build and should always be your first priority when starting off a fight. Its survivability, its grenade regen, and it allows you to apply Weaken, which is amazing for boss DPS rotations. Devour is what enables you to be aggressive, and stacking it on top of all the damage resist that you get from Frost Armor and Transcendence, and on top of Void Overshields, makes you feel very unkillable. For this next tip, you by no means need to do any of this, but if you're wanting to get the maximum amount of damage out of your grenades, there's a couple of things you're going to want to do beforehand. Firstly, make sure that you're Radiant from picking up an orb, as this is going to apply the 25% damage boost from Shield Crush. Then, you'll want to throw out your Threaded Spike to apply Sever, or be using a primary with Slice, which will let you proc Facet of Courage. You'll also want to make sure that Death Throws is at max stacks, and that you've got Devour so that you can weaken with Buried Bloodline. Speaking on grenades as well, in Transcendence we're going to be able to throw an absolutely absurd amount of grenades. During Transcendence, dealing melee damage will increase your grenade regen and vice versa, but because Hailfire Spike ticks so often for damage, Your Threaded Spike pretty much always has that increased regen, which means you can throw that out really often and then get much higher uptime on your Transcendent Grenade. And this same tech is what makes this build viable in boss DPS settings. Make sure you've got all of your damage boosts ready, and then apply Weaken with Buried Bloodline, throw Threaded Spike, throw Gunpowder Gamble, throw Magnetic, Transcend, throw Hailfire, throw Threaded Spike, proc Bait and Switch, whilst reprocking Weaken from Buried Bloodline, then heavy down the boss, working in Hailfire spikes with Threaded Spikes. If you can, you'll also want to try kill and add during these damage phases, as it'll allow you to extend your death throws timer and keep up that 100% grenade damage boost. And that's the build. I really can't recommend this one enough. It's so much fun, and it took me a couple of days to really get used to it, but once I did, I was having an absolute blast. Let me know your thoughts on the build. It's been through a couple of variations where I was running Dominance at some point. I was also running Mending and Dawn. So if you end up tweaking some bits in the build, I'd love to hear. For now though, best of luck on your exotic class item hunts and enjoy the build. That's about it from me though. See ya.